Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in. I'm Ashley Mueller with the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, joined by Dr. TONG ZHAO of the Carnegie-Tsinghua Centre in Beijing. He is a fellow there. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So to jump right in here to my first question, could you please give us some insight on what is your view on the current US and China relationship?
I think there is a real risk that the bilateral relationship can become something like a new Cold War. I think we're at this turning point where the direction of this relationship can deteriorate very quickly, very fast into a comprehensive competition relationship. So I'm very worried. I think even though both leaders in the two countries want to avoid a comprehensive competition, but we are actually heading in that direction.
So also in your opinion, what are the major underpinning factors in the increasing competition between these two powers?
Well, I think there are some important fundamental drivers of the deteriorating bilateral relationship. One important thing is the two countries increasingly have differences in terms of ideology. This current Chinese administration is increasingly confident about Chinese own model, Chinese own traditional ideology, and it believes in values that are simply contradictory to mainstream Western values. For example, the Chinese mainstream thinking is, the top priority for China is to maintain domestic stability. That's the basis for future economic development. That's the guarantee for Chinese people to enjoy higher living standards in the future. That's the utmost important form of human rights for Chinese people. And in order to maintain that domestic stability, we may have to sacrifice some individual civil rights. And thus you have seen these recent measures to tighten domestic control, concentrating powers to the highest level, etc. Those are simply values not shared by Western countries, especially the United States. I think the two countries increasingly have wider and wider ideological gap, which means they don't share the same set of values. That's the fundamental driver for them to develop greater misunderstandings and misperceptions and mistrust between them.
There was recently a speech by U.S. Vice President Mike Pence, and with major claims to China, given new security, new defense strategy, the trade war. It seems like there's been a bit of a shift of an American approach, a U.S. approach, from a peaceful coexistence to more of a strategic confrontation, strategic competition with China. What do you think about that?
I think the speech by Vice President Pence reflects the mainstream thinking among the U.S. policy circle in terms of the U.S. attitudes towards China. It's not just a sudden change of policy initiated by President Trump or his top advisors. It's a more fundamental change within the entire U.S. policy community. They increasingly believe China is behaving aggressively. China might have expansionist objectives, and China is bullying others in the neighborhood, and therefore the United States has to try to check and balance this increasing Chinese influence to avoid China doing more harm to regional peace and stability. That has also raised a lot of concerns in Beijing, because we see the US now committed to conducting a comprehensive competition with us, and therefore this also encourages Beijing to take massive countermeasures. So it really leads to greater hostility between the two countries. A couple of weeks ago I was in DC, and the entire environment felt very differently. Today US officials wouldn't even want to exchange name cards with me, believing that letting me know their email address is a serious security threat. So they are now really starting to put China in a category that is similar to Soviet Union, to former Soviet Union. So this sense, this feeling of emerging comprehensive competition is really serious.
If I may ask, what is the tone in China, for example, when there is this sense of maybe a sense of defense or a sense of categorization? Could you just shed some light on that internally, how that is being received?
So basically, the change of attitude from Washington reinforces the long-existing Chinese belief that the US has long sought to contain China. The US cannot afford seeing China becoming a rising power that even surpasses the United States in terms of the economy and military capability and regional influence. And therefore, the US is now trying to do everything possible, working with allies, with friendly countries in this region and in the world, to contain China's rise. China believes that its right to peacefully develop and peacefully rise as emerging power is being denied by Western countries led by the United States. So that sense of very cynical view, very cynical interpretation of American intention is really driving up Chinese interest in developing even more forceful countermeasures. So that's a very negative dynamic.
So it really looks like there seems to be two options, maybe one that is more about leading towards conflict perhaps, and one that is leading towards cooperation. In your view, where is this headed?
I do believe the deteriorating relationship is driven by fundamental problems. Like I said, there are a widening gap of ideological difference. And also internally, under this Chinese administration, the domestic control is tighter, and therefore the room for free policy debate on important foreign and security issues is smaller. As a result, it is increasingly difficult for liberal voices to check and balance the nationalistic hawkish voices. So it's easier for people who argue for tougher foreign policies for their voice to dominate in the national narrative. So that's fundamental problems. But I think we have to recognize China itself really perceives itself as being purely self-defensive. We still see ourselves as only trying to defend our own legitimate national security and economic interests. We didn't see ourselves as being expansionist. And so the deep problem is this perception gap. And if the Western countries simply trying to counter China with more forceful measures, economic pressure, trade war, military capability deployment around China, those forceful measures will only reinforce this Chinese perception about evil intentions of Western countries. So we have to address the fundamental issue, and the best way to address it, and maybe the only way to address it, is to face it first, to recognize that, and then to engage, to do more engagement with China. The reason why China develops this very biased understanding of Western intentions is because China and many members of Chinese policy community don't have nuanced understanding of U.S. foreign policy, of U.S.-China policy. So you have to make even greater effort to introduce American thinking to the broader Chinese policy community. I think that's the only way to gradually bridge the perception gap and to find greater areas of common interest and cooperation.
Thank you. And if I may move on to now a recent topic, the US withdrawal of the INF Treaty. I think you've recently written a commentary on this very topic. In your views, what is the meaning of the US withdrawal? And is it aimed at Russia or China specifically as known adversaries, for example?
According to public comments made by senior US officials, including President Trump, the reason behind the US decision to withdraw from the INF Treaty is as much about China as about Russia. It might be even more about China than about Russia. even though the decision is very much influenced by some unique factors like the personal influence of John Bolton, who dislikes arms control in general, but the decision also reflects a shared concern within the Washington Policy Committee about the unchecked development of Chinese medium and intermediate range land-based missiles in the Asia-Pacific region, and how that could undermine the U.S. capability and U.S. Security guarantee to allies in this region. So those are real American concerns. So I think those concerns are very much driven the decision to withdraw. And by declaring this withdrawal and by pointing at China as the main reason for doing this, the US is basically sending a very clear signal that now US is really dedicated to a comprehensive competition, even including a comprehensive military competition with China. Even if that means the US has to walk out of its previous arms control agreements, that's fine. That's the price the US is willing to pay in order to win this competition. So that's a message that will not be well received in Beijing. And I don't think that decision can encourage China to think more about participating in a future multilateral arms control regime in this region to constrain its military deployment, but will actually, I think, encourage Beijing to invest more in such capabilities. So I think that's a very important factor for even for long-range arms race.
Thank you. Now, you're also an expert on nuclear disarmament. Now, moving to the Far East region and the Korean Peninsula, for example, could you shed some light on what is happening there? Where are the negotiations at? Do you think that there are any alternatives to these negotiations? What is your view on that?
Well, in terms of North Korea, we are basically facing a real dilemma here, which is if North Korea starts to implement denuclearization, after the denuclearization process proceeds beyond certain stage, it would basically become an irreversible process, especially after North Korea completely dismantles the basic infrastructure for maintaining and supporting its nuclear and missile capabilities. It would be very difficult for North Korea to rebuild that capability. So it is an irreversible process on the North Korean part. But for the US to provide security guarantee, credible security guarantee to North Korea is very difficult because it's almost impossible for security guarantee to become irreversible. Even if the US is willing to withdraw troops from the region, it can always redeploy those troops rather quickly. Even if the US is willing to sign a peace treaty with North Korea ratified by the US Senate, the next White House, the next US president can always walk out of that treaty without congressional consent. So that's not very binding on the American part either. So that's an objective dilemma. It's hard to convince North Koreans that security guarantee can be really credible. And therefore, my personal view is, given how paranoid the North Korean government is about its regime security, it's very hard for them to willingly give up their nuclear weapons before they can really feel assured about their security. So denuclearization process will have to be a very long process. It requires basic confidence and trust being built between the two long-standing enemies, US and North Korea.
And my final question is on that question of trust. What are the steps that could be taken? How can these two powers meet each other halfway, if I may?
I think given how challenging it is to convince North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons in the near-term future before trust can be built, before North Korea-US relationship can be fundamentally transformed from hostile one to a friendly one, I think we need to focus on more realistic objectives. Firstly, we need to focus on how to limit and prevent North Korea's capability from further advancing. Given the root cause of North Korea's nuclear ambition is its sense of insecurity, its paranoia. The best way to address that is to open North Korea up, is to encourage interaction between North Korea and the international community. Only that engagement at all levels, including people-to-people exchange, can, in the long run, gradually help North Korea develop a better and more accurate understanding about the outside world, to become less paranoid, and to become an increasingly rational, normal country. Its mindset can be changed in the long run, and only after that is achieved, I think North Korea would become less dependent on nuclear weapons. So it's important for us to focus on the real goal, which is to change North Korea's mindset, to make North Korea fundamentally less obsessed with nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure to interview you here today.
Thank you, my pleasure.